different from New York and how the internet dating wouldn't have worked set in Portland. So I'm assuming that the police work is going to be significantly different too. What kind of adjustments did you have to make from what you learned with the Portland police to what you accounted to the New York
So it's
police?
not that different, really. I mean, the precinct that Ellie works out of is the 13th precinct, which is only about 10 blocks from where I live, and they've been pretty good about, surprisingly and dangerously good, about just letting me walk in and wander around and ask questions and see what stuff looks like before I write about it. And I have a couple of NYPD sources who, help me just make sure that I have the lingo right, because in Portland sometimes they use words that are very unique to Portland, and he'll tell me that no, that form in New York is called a DD5, just sort of those little tiny quotidian details, I've kind of gotten both through observation and through advice, frankly.
So have you had any New York police officers writing you saying you got it wrong?
No. I actually get a lot of email from cops who appreciate, they're like, this is actually pretty accurate, you kind of know your stuff. So I always am, I feel very proud about that, get to keep my street cred.
Okay, when you were writing Samantha, you did an interview where you talked about how you felt her role offered you a lot of flexibility that you didn't really see in the rest of the crime fiction genre. So now you're writing about a police detective. Do you feel like there's places where you're confined with Ellie?
No, not really, because Ellie is the kind of character, she's very driven to do what is right, but that's by her own idea of what is right. So she has done things that she probably ought not to have done in the past because it's true to her character. It's what she thinks of as the right thing to do. And so I haven't really had a problem reconciling my notion of her character with her job, because she's not really defined totally by her job. One of the challenges, surprisingly, because I like my books to feel authentic, New York has gotten so famously safe, right? I mean, it's the crime rate goes lower and lower and lower every year, and people bring their kids there for vacation and stay in Times Square, which used to be like the seediest place in the world, and now it's like Disneyland. And one of the challenges for me is finding something really, really scary to take place in the fancier parts of Manhattan. Because my books are set in the Village and Midtown and in luxury hotels, and it's like if Sex and the City were scary, how does that happen? And so the challenge for me for the series has been thinking about how do victims become vulnerable even in a setting that sterile to some extent. So Dead Connection did that with internet dating because people are making themselves vulnerable. They're being much more trusting than they would be in other environments. Angel's Tip is based on nightclubs. So there are all these, I'm sure you remember a couple years ago, it seemed like every 2 months some beautiful woman disappeared from some beautiful nightclub and was never seen again, or her body was found the next day. And so Angel's Tip was based on a college student on spring break going to one of the coolest clubs in the meatpacking district and wandering off with some guy she didn't know, never to be seen again. So that was, and then 212 is based on the Ashley Dupreys of the world, Elliot Spitzer's Call Girl. These seemingly privileged girls who are selling themselves on the internet, and the line between Facebooking somebody and then setting a date, so to speak, on Craigslist for $100, that line becomes so thin in their mind morally that they put themselves in these incredibly dangerous positions. So the series is, they've all involved situations of women kind of putting themselves at risk.
Okay, we've talked a little bit about content. Now I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about your writing and your methods for writing. One of the things that I really appreciate, and I'll try to keep my enthusiasm about this to a minimum so I don't get too carried away. I just reviewed this book yesterday. I just finished reading it, and I also re-listened to Dead Connection. And one of the strengths that I try to point out about Alafair's writing is her dialogue writing. It's seamless, and it is awesome. And if you listen to the audiobook, for me, there were points where I was laughing out loud in the car. I'm sure the people parked next to me or at the stop sign thought I was a little loony, but the dialogue is just magnificent. So how do you make sure that you can keep that it's seamless, that you're not saying he said, she said every other line?
I listen to how people talk, and I think people have unique voices, and I don't mean accents. I never try to write an accent. You know, the word choice. I have friends that just have their own way of speaking, and it marks it as unique. And so I hear characters' voices. I'm sure that makes me insane by some definition in a manual. But it's like I told you, my favorite writers now, one of the best things about this gig is to meet other writers whose work you admire so much. Once I meet them, I can't read their books without hearing their voices. And so before I write a character, not just my main character, it's like even just, you know, a crime technician who shows up with the lab results, I really do hear their voice and think about the way they would say something and try to make it in a way that's unique so that each character has a different way of speaking, a different way they would choose their words, so that ideally you're not having to say, Rogan said, Ellie said, Rogan said, Ellie said. It's just they speak differently so that they each have a unique voice.
Okay, I just got a sign that says we're running out of time. See, I told you that I can talk to her for a long time. She's fascinating. So I want to jump ahead and talk about her new book a little bit before we get cut off. The title of the new book is 212, and Harlan Coben is quoted as saying, the plot of an Alafair Burke book, thriller, doesn't just rip from the headlines, she's one step ahead of them. And that has a special connection with 212. You want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, well, I mean, 212, it's actually a little scary. With all of my books, I've intentionally drawn upon something that will be familiar to the reader, and then I try to turn it upside down. And I had drawn on a lot of things that are real for 212, and most notably, Eliot Spitzer's downfall, that idiot. And then Neil Goldschmidt was the former governor of Oregon, who had, was very much a civic hero, had bettered the city and the state, and was he was the Secretary of Transportation for a while. I mean, a very admirable person in the policy world. And then it came out 30 years after the fact that while he was mayor of Portland, he had had what he called an affair with the family's 14-year-old babysitter. And needless to say, his reputation went down from there. So I drew upon those kind of two political scandals, and also combined it with, there was a website that is now defunct, thank goodness, it was called Juicy Campus, which was catered to the college crowd, and it promised all the juice all the time, totally anonymously. And it encouraged college students to go online and promise them complete anonymity, to just trash each other, to say horrible things about each other, and there were terrible stories that came out of that, but people who were ruined, because rumors went around about them on campus that couldn't be tracked down or disproven, and so there's a separate part of the story that has to do with an anonymous website like that. And then I got very much into the modern sex trade, which is not done on street corners anymore, but online. And it turns out there's a website called Erotic Review. Hopefully none of you are familiar with it. But it's like Amazon.com for call girls. You can go on there and rate their services, and they have pages where they call themselves providers, and the quote-unquote hobbyists who hire their companionship can rate them for appearance, professional, whether they show up on time, what they will and won't do in graphic detail, and it's all online. It's perfect because they don't. To me, it's blatant. You look at it, it's prostitution, but because they don't use that word, they call it a hobby, and they call it service providers. So there's this very blatant online sex trade that goes on. So 212 in my mind was about those political scandals, about the online sex trade, and I turned in the manuscript the end of March of last year. It shows you how long they have a book before it comes out. So I finished it a year ago. And 2 weeks later is when the Craigslist killer case happened, where a girl in New York None of her friends knew she was doing this. A girl in New York was making dates on Craigslist, calling herself a masseuse, and she had made a date in Boston